One of the things I love most about this podcast is being able to interview some really interesting people, and today is no exception. Something that I don't think many of us really think about is about the generations that we fit into and what is happening with our population. So today I am honored to be speaking with Bradley Schurman, whose new book, The Super Age, was just released. Welcome, Bradley.
Hi, Michelle Newman. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for being on the new mid.
Of course, it's great to be here with you today.
Okay. One of the stories I absolutely love is how you started working at AARP in your 20s. Now, that is not something I would think is normal. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a full-on weirdo. I I was an unusual person at the time. I think I'm a bit of an unusual person today. But I started at AARP in my 20s, but I actually started somewhere else before AARP. I actually worked for an organization called Leading Age. And Leading Age is the nonprofit trade association for nursing homes in this country. And if you thought working for AARP in your mid 20s was weird, imagine what working for a nursing home organization in your young 20s felt like. People thought I was just bizarre. And the path that took me there was one that revolved around my grandparents. And I think a lot of people who get into aging and longevity, they tend to have a very personal connection to it. Typically, a loved one who needs care. And for me, my grandparents entered long term care, but it wasn't the care that got me excited. It was what I witnessed as I went back and forth from my home, my birth home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to my adopted home in Washington, D.C., where I was at school at American University. On that trip, as I would get closer to the center of the state of Pennsylvania, I'd noticed the populations were becoming older, whiter, poorer, and there were a lot of people that were my grandparents' age that were actively engaged in work. Everything from cleaning toilets at rest stops to waiting tables at restaurants to even pumping gas. And it was that moment, probably around 18 or 19, where I was just thinking to myself, this doesn't make sense. And when I can't jive something in my head, I immediately try to figure out why it doesn't jive. And I started digging. And what I found was that the world was actually changing right in front of me, in front of all of us. And it was very hard to see because our world and our vision and how we see things was very much focused on youth, not on realities. So as I looked around the world, as I saw places like Japan and Germany and Italy that were aging at a far faster rate than us, I thought to myself, this is coming here soon because I'm seeing what's happening there in the countryside already. So the countryside, in many ways, was the canary in the coal mine. It was the first real place where demographic change, this aging of our population, was happening, and no one could see it. So yeah, I was a bit weird at the time because I said, look at the change that's happening. And people said, there's no change happening. Nothing's new, nothing's unusual. And, roughly 25 years later, the world's waking up to the fact that we're living in a very different, very older, and for the first time ever, generationally diverse planet.
That's incredible you had the awareness. I mean, at 18 or 19 to look out your window and notice what's around you is pretty remarkable. I mean, for an 18 or 20-year-old even,
I
or even
mean,
a 40 or 50-year-old at this point.
I think you're being very kind. I think for me, it's just not being able to understand when something doesn't fit into what I've been told things should fit.
Right.
And when you think about it, we've all been fed this idea of retirement.
Yes.
Retirement is a construct, and it's one of the most pervasive constructs that we have. I mean, when I say retirement to you, if you don't automatically think of an old white couple walking down the beach with the waves lapping at your feet, um, you're a bit out of place because that's what we've been conditioned to think retirement looks like. But retirement historically in this country has only belonged to the few. It's never been something that the masses could really take up. And in many ways, I think it was a false pretense, the fact that we can and should stop work. Stopping work really is problematic on so many fronts. And retirement, at least as we know it, isn't going to fit into this new era and is most likely dead. A, we can't afford it. B, it's better to have people engaged in work for the larger economy. And C, and this is relatively recent research, although we've known it for a long time, science is just pointing it out to us now. Staying in work keeps us mentally healthy. It keeps us physically fit. It prevents us from becoming isolated. And I'm sure you've heard that oft quoted stat now. Isolation is as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So
Especially after what we've been through.
exactly. So when we think about this new era is rejecting some of the bad ideas of the old era. Things that we thought during the mid-century were revolutionary and could change the way we work and live. In reality, a lot of the things that existed pre-mid-century, pre-retirement, may actually be better for us in the long run.
Well, is this what you're talking about? Is this what you mean by the super age? Is that why you were inspired to write this book? Because of all of everything that you were noticing and realizing the whole debunking of retirement at 65? It's funny because you just automatically think, like you were saying, an old white couple walking down the street and being 65 years old. And I don't know about you, but 65 is getting a lot younger as I get closer to that
Yeah.
number.
Well, I think stepping back a moment here, I think the first thing you have to say what the definition of the super age is, and it's a technical definition. It's when 1 out of 5 people is over the age of 65. This is something that the UN decided a long time ago. So it's borrowing from that. But the conversations around the super age prior to my book were ones that were really filled with gloom and doom. Pension systems would collapse, healthcare systems would no longer operate. Young people would have to carry all of this extra burden for the old populations because there would be much more older people and much fewer younger people. But the reality is that we've been thinking about aging the wrong way. You see, every time there's been some type of technological or industrial revolution, we've extended life because we've succeeded in doing two things. We've lowered mortality rates for children and youth, and we've increased human longevity at each industrial revolution. What that does is that it doesn't just tack extra years onto life at the end, which most people assume it does. We actually push all of these extra healthy years into the middle. So when you say 65 seems like a ridiculous time to retire, to us in this modern period, it does. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And the fact that anyone thinks that retiring at 65 is a good idea, they're crazy. Now, 65 does have historical construct to it. This dates back to the Roman period where you could get out of certain government duties, things like jury duty or serving in the military at 65. But this idea of a universal guaranteed pension, retirement savings from the state, that didn't come about until the late 1800s. The first private pension from a corporation was actually developed by American Express in the late 1800s. So when you think about the history of the world, at least recorded history for humanity, about 5,000 years or so, of those 5,000 years, we've taken 100 and said, we're just going to change what we've always done. And we've done so in a world where our populations have gotten very old very fast. In fact, life expectancies, as you know, and I'm sure some of your listeners do, have roughly doubled over the course of 100 years. So the old system doesn't work anymore. We
Right,
have to
right.
find new models for this new era.
Well, you're talking about also the perception of age, and your book talks about that, the difference
Mhm.
between perception of age and the reality of age. And what are some of the big misconceptions you would say that you, whilst writing your book, came across? Because I think, you were touching upon it, and it's true. The old adage is not working for us anymore.
Yeah.
So, what do you think is the reality for us? As I sit here at 53, and I know a lot of midlife women, are wondering, okay, what should I be thinking about in this new reality?
Yeah. We carry a lot of baggage from the past. And that's an important thing for folks to remember as they consider this new period. Humans are inherently vain people. We want to look good. We want to feel good. We've constantly searched for a fountain of youth. This is recorded as far back as the Greeks. In Egyptian times, it wasn't unusual for Egyptian people, because of the dry desert in which Egypt flourished, for them to use a substance called unguent to smooth out the wrinkles on their skin. Cleopatra took baths in goat's milk to keep her skin firm and tight. Um, but what happened, I think, in the 20th century in particular, is that we started inventing problems that come with age. One manufacturer quite literally manufactured the problem of middle-aged skin for women. Like somehow women needed to look young as long as possible. And I think the reality is that youthism, or this embrace of youth, is pervasive. I do think that there is this ageism that exists that really focuses on looks in particular, and women almost always bear the brunt of this bias. But given the fact that our populations of older people are growing, and growing at an astronomical rate, both in the community and in the workplace, I think there's greater license to live as you want to live, not as the way others want you to live. I think there's greater interest, certainly in some segments of the female population, to do away with the coloring of the hair or constantly wearing makeup. But there are some realities too mixed in with this. And one is, probably the largest, is beauty, fitness, plastic surgery are huge and growing business interests in this world. The fashion industry alone makes up 2% of global GDP.
Oh my gosh.
Plastic surgery grows year on year. The fitness industry goes year on year. So there's a mix of lookism that fits into this, but there's also this desire, I think, for individuals to both to feel good and present as relevant and connected, because looks do matter.
Yes.
As our workforces, though, I think, become more generationally diverse, and they will be, because there are just economic factors that are pushing them in that direction, I do think lookism will change. Our definition of what is considered acceptable in the workplace will shift. It always does. That's the thing. It's a constant moving target.
Well, talking about the workplace, we're going to have so many boomers retiring.
We've
They
had
already kind of are, right?
we've had a lot of boomers exit the workforce. That's how I usually like to present it, because a lot of times it isn't by choice.
Hmm.
And for those of us that are in the workforce space and understand demographics, pre-pandemic, 2030 was really our year. We said 2030 is about the time where we're going to have to see major change, because the rates of departure from the workforce are going to create some already systemic problems, but could actually create some structural problems within the workforce. And then COVID happened. And COVID was like shooting steroids into the system of change, and things that we considered to be far off in the future happened overnight. And ageism played a role. There's no denying that. Pure economics played a role. There's no denying that. And fear played an even bigger role. There's no denying that. And let me explain. The first is that ageism was prevalent at the beginning of the pandemic, and a lot of businesses decided to cut fat, as they called it, cut fat at the time. So they took a look at their balance sheets. They said, who are the most expensive? Who are the most easy to replace? And they decided that on the whole, older people filled that role. So they cut them. In the dark of night, they cut people because of their age, because they cost too much. The second piece is fear. We told people over the age of 65, falsely, mind you, that if they were to go out and go to work, or even go shopping to the grocery store, they were going to get COVID and die.
Right.
That's factually incorrect. On the whole, there is a greater chance that an individual who is older will get COVID and die. but health conditions actually play a much greater role as a predictor of that outcome than the age of a person. Age itself was a terrible measure, but we kept telling people, if you're over 65, you're going to get sick and die. The third is that there were just some economic forces that presented themselves to older populations, especially those that were at or nearing retirement. And the market, at least in the United States, did incredibly well during the pandemic, to a point where if you're a rational actor in the market and you're invested in the market, you said, time to pay by Vegas rules, baby. I'm pulling my money out. I'm top of my game. I'm not going to go any higher than this. So what that did was it pulled a large number of older workers out of the workforce all at once. Now, couple that with the reality that there is this great resignation right now. I don't love that term. I prefer calling it something more along the lines of the great realignment. There's a hard time getting people back into jobs. Some of it is because of pay, some of it's because of benefits. I still hear older people complaining about the fact that they can't get jobs. They can't even get interviews. So that suggests to me that there's a big problem with the way we're recruiting as well. At the end of the day, though, we are entering a long, drawn-out period of shrinking workforces in this country. And if we don't engage older populations, our economy could stall. And that's a really scary thing. We're really good in the United States about capturing data. That's one thing the United States government does incredibly well. And the census is one of those places that I just am in love with. It is one of the best places in the US government. And the census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics have suggested, based on our census data, that the over 75 workforce in this country will grow by 100% by the end of this decade. That's
Wow,
incredible.
that's
Now,
huge.
the total workforce during the same period of time will only grow by 5% or so, and the 16 to 24 age group will actually contract.
Okay, so what is going on?
We're not having a lot of kids.
Wow.
We have entered a period now, it's been 6 years of continual decline in birth rates in the United States. Continual decline. And last year, Michelle, 2020, was our lowest birth rate on record in the United States.
Interesting, because people thought there would be a baby boom again, but it was just the opposite, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I've never really understood where people got this idea there was going to be a boom. Baby booms are typically attached to periods of great prosperity, not periods of terrible economic, health, wartime crises. In fact, when you take a look at the United States from the period of the First World War to the end of the Second World War, that was a very compressed period of time in terms of births in this country. A lot of kids just weren't born then. And this is a time when we were having a lot of kids. So taking a look at today, I'm sure you've heard people say, the pandemic was like having the Great Depression and the Second World War and all these different things at the same time. It's true. It was a compressed event, but anyone who thought that we were going to see an increase in births, I think, is insane.
Well, they thought people had time on their hands. I think that's what it was. They weren't as
Yeah.
busy.
Time is not the only thing that goes into making kids. I mean,
I think there's actually a lot more to it, Bradley, with our men's semen. We don't have to get into that, going down with our environment. I think there's a lot of different
yeah, there's a lot of different components that go into it, but from a social point of view, and that's where my expertise is. I don't have the scientific background to opine on men's fertility per se, but I think from a social point of view, I think there is something to the fact that women are more educated. There's a greater survival rate for children. There's greater access to birth control and family planning. And it's really expensive to have a child now.
Yes.
And children used to be net producers in the home. So I think about my grandfather, who was born in 1914. By the age of 14 years old, so by 1928, my grandfather was working in the mines.
Wow.
I
But
don't think,
at
I
14,
don't, at
that's
14, like outside of, traditional rural families where kids work from the time they can until the time they can't,
right.
um, that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, you've got kids. Can you imagine your child going into the mines at 14? It just doesn't work that way. And my grandfather went into the mines not because he wanted to, it was because he had to for the family to survive. So the family unit, before this great demographic transition happened, before the second, really between the second and third industrial revolutions, which happened just before and just after the First World War, you know, families were an economic unit too. Now families are very much a social unit. You aren't thinking about having kids to toil the fields. You're
Right.
thinking about kids and legacy. And
Right.
that's a shift in attitudes towards birth.
It sounds to me too that we really need to be working across generations.
Yep.
Now that's really become important. What do you think the best ways for that to happen?
There are areas in which there is generational unity already. And I think it's up to leaders essentially to exploit those realities. I think in the workplace, for example, regardless of how old you are, people like this idea of flexibility. That's something that every single worker should be demanding today because it's something that we can all come together on. I do think that there are areas within social change, the social change movement, the economic and social justice areas, where we saw data proved that the people in the streets were young and old. It was the people in the middle that sat out. Um, so there are areas of commonality. One of the things that we have to get away from is being absolute about generations. Generations are a good marker, but they're not the exclusive marker because as a late Gen Xer, I tend to attach myself more culturally, more economically, more politically with millennials than I do Gen X. But my sensibilities are unmistakably Gen X. And there are certain life events that we all live through with our generations that help shape us. I'll never forget what it was like the day the Challenger exploded or the Berlin Wall came down. I mean, those emote in your mind immediately what that felt like, but I'll never be able to understand what it felt like when John Kennedy was killed. I'll never be able to experience or understand that euphoria of winning the war or getting a man to the moon. And I'll never be a digital native. I've lived in a digital world for most of my life. I had a computer in my home, which was a great gift when I was 7 years old, but I'll never be a digital native.
Right. I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant. Oh gosh. Why I love this because I'm not age is just a number, and I
Uh-huh.
love that you're talking about not identifying just with your generation. So
Yeah.
why did we come up with these generations? Why did we talk about it, naming it the baby boomers and the Gen X and the millennials? Where did that come about? And I had a conversation with you about a month ago, and you were saying there's even another sort of generation that's kind of evolving, the 75 plus, that is sort of living on their assets. So,
Yeah. Well, I think there's two pieces to this question. There are generations: boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and then of course the silent generation. And there are a number of them still with us, including the president. Um, those markers are really artificial. There are factors that go into them, but it's certainly not a perfect science. I think that's why so many folks reject it as a way that people fit in. What I think you're asking about is this idea of life stage. And life stage is, I think, a much better predictor of human behavior than the generations that you fall into. So when my grandfather was born, there were essentially three stages to life. You were a child, then you were adult, and you were old. And those three life stages served the world for most of human history, certainly all of written history. However, like I said, whenever there's these technological, industrial, scientific revolutions, the life extends. And with every extension of life, new life stages kind of figure their way into the equation. So coming out of the war, what's the first thing that happens? The boom. And the boom creates a whole new group of consumers that we'd already been talking about for about 30 or 40 years, this group of teenagers, adolescents. But it wasn't until after the war that this was this, just the swelling number of people, that the baby boom that fit this description really became the dominant generation. So life stage, teenagers, generation boomers. By the middle of the century, and about until I would say the 1990s or early 2000s, we had a true retirement as a life stage. People had strong state pensions, strong corporate pensions. They were able to stop. They were able to enjoy. They were able to move away from work and just be passively earning income from their investments. This extension of life is moving people into a new life stage that I call the middle plus. Sometimes I'll call these people super agers. Chip Conley, who's written a wonderful book, calls them the modern elders. There's a lot of names for these people because they are a novel group. We're just starting to get a language around them. But typically this group of people, and I'm not going to put an age on them because that's unfair, but if you're to draw a bell curve, it probably starts around 45 and goes up as high as to about 85, with the majority of people falling somewhere in the middle of that bell curve. But 45 is not a starting point. Don't mistake that. What's interesting about this group of people, especially those that are within the older age cohort, is they exhibit cognitive functionality that is similar to younger people. These folks tend to be engaged in work in some way, typically through earning, part-time or full-time employment, entrepreneurship, cottage industries. Sometimes volunteering plays a big role. But when they're earning, they're active consumers. And of course, they're more attractive to companies because they can spend. They're healthy, or they want to engage their health in a more meaningful way. That's why products like the Apple Watch and Apple products in general are used most by men over the age of 65 than any other group. That's why Peloton has been such a success. And its target market is 35 to 65. That's why I thought it was so funny when Mr. Big passed away on the Sex and the City reboot. I thought, oh my God, they're going to blame Peloton. And thanks to Ryan Reynolds, they turn around. Mr. Big, who's well into his 60s, is brought back to life miraculously and featured as a central character in the new advertisement. I thought, that's pretty cool. Like, holding out there somebody who's older as a selling point for a device is really awesome. And they captured the narrative and said, it does improve your cardio, it does improve X, Y, and Z, that gets you to greater health outcomes. But that group, this group of super agers, this group of middle plus, this group of modern elders, are all really interested in their health and taking a more active and more meaningful control over it. And I think part of that is that we do tend to live in both worlds, the new era that we're kind of figuring out and the old era that we've been taught. But that mark line of 40 to 50, that's that line. I mean, we start to think to ourselves, oh, I guess this is the time I should make some adjustments if I want to live healthy longer. And I think most people that fall into this group right now do fall on the higher side of income, the higher side of education on the whole. There's obviously exceptions to every rule, but I think with any kind of emerging group, those that are wealthier and better educated tend to lead the charge. And these folks are going to be demanding new products and services. I mean, we're already seeing how their demands and their realities are showing up in the design of automobiles. Anything from the push button start to, rear view cameras, these weren't designed just to ooh and ah people. They were designed because they're good, inclusive design that help people retain their mobility for longer periods of time. Um, you will not
Right.
find you will not find an automaker who will tell you that they're essentially designed for an older customer, but that's really who they're there for at the end of the day.
A lot of times I think it's funny because when you're talking about this, I just kept nodding my head thinking that's the new mid. This
Yeah.
is the new midlife. We are living longer. We are, taking care of ourselves. In your book, the super age, what would you say is the golden nugget for the new mid to take away from this, to really hold on to it and realize, like, okay, this is the new demographic. This is what we are doing, living healthier. So we're paving kind of a new path.
Oh, we are the pioneers. There's no debating that. I mean, obviously the boomers are out there kind of feeling it out for us right now, but for those of us who are going to be following and entering this period shortly, we're going to be the first settlers of this new era. And with that in mind, we're going to have to adopt strategies now, if we haven't done so already, around the way we work, around the way we live, around the way we engage society at whole. My friend Carrie Hannon, who's written a number of books about workforce, she always says one of the greatest things that people can do is maintain their curiosity. And I think that is probably the best advice that anyone can hand out to anyone anywhere, especially in this period of life, because you are going to have to compete for these jobs, even though there's going to be more jobs available, and they're likely going to be more attractive than in previous generations due to um, labor market contractions. It doesn't mean that you can't just stop and say, well, I'm older, so I should get this job. That doesn't work that way. It never has. You have to be able to differentiate yourself. I think that there are things that we can do to enhance our homes, so that we can ensure that we can live in them longer, because all of us, for the most part, I mean, I think recent research suggested that 8 out of 10 people want to stay in their homes until they die. I've seen other research that suggests that 9 out of 10 people want to do it. Regardless, it's a super majority of us that want to stay at home. But here's the deal: when we're in middle age and when we're making investments on rethinking or renovating our home, which is what we do, people who are middle age and above spend the most on any home renovations than any other group of people combined. We don't consider our next needs. We only consider our now needs. Okay. So, in considering the bathroom, for example, the bathroom is one of the more sacred places in the home. It's the one place where we get privacy. It's the one place where we need privacy. Nobody likes to watch them be watched while they're toileting themselves or bathing themselves. We'd like to have that license to do that on our own. And we can make minor adjustments to that space to make it safer, more enjoyable for longer periods of time. If we don't do that and we fall, for example,
Right.
then we have to throw in some kind of slapstick, like awful grab bars, some terrible lighting, because that's what fits in our immediate need. And then you have this kind of like ugly thing sitting in your bathroom, which is a constant reminder of your deficit or your
Right.
deficiency. We can build beautiful spaces that are inclusive, that consider that we may decline.
Right.
Grab bars don't have to be ugly.
Right.
um
And you know what? It's funny, but I personally don't mind higher toilet seats.
oh, I think that those have to be universal, because there's nothing worse than a one of those medical toilet seats that go on an old toilet. They're just awful to look at. But that's because those things signal decline to us.
Right.
And if
Yeah.
we have them in our bathrooms after an event, they're a constant reminder that we are no longer strong.
Right.
And
Right.
I think personally, I think they impede folks from getting better. I think the third thing is, so we've got maintaining curiosity and position at work, always learning so you can always earn, modifying your bathrooms and your living space as much as you can to anticipate your needs, not for now, but for the next. And the third thing is, I think folks need to really watch their health. one of the chances we get in this middle life period is to undo some of the some of the mistakes that we've made and incorporate healthy behaviors that will not only let us live longer, but will let us live healthier. Because one of the great fears is that we eventually fall into sickness. Well, if we maintain healthy behaviors, if we maintain healthy lifestyles, we can actually compress morbidity, which means that we can shorten the number of years that we're sick. And that's a good thing for all of us because not only is it cheaper, pure economics here, but it's a lot more pleasant. It's a lot more pleasant just to die one day than to be
Right.
in decline and on oxygen or relegated to a hospital or a nursing home. That's a dark ending, and not one that anyone wants to engage. So I think those three things are the things that folks in this new mid, as you call it, really should be focused on.
Well, and I love this book because you bring a lot of awareness, and that we're kind of going full circle. You started at 1890 with 18 or 19 with the awareness of what was going on with your grandparents and looking around you. This book, I just think, brings so much awareness to what's going on, and it gives us a head start as we are aging. So I really encourage everyone to run out and get the Super Age. Bradley, thank you so much for being on the show. And is there anything we didn't touch on that you just wanted to make sure, as we say goodbye, as we wrap up, is there anything we didn't cover that you wanted to?
I think if there's anything, Michelle, it's that this new period is going to be incredibly cool and incredibly fun. And if we make those little changes to our day-to-day lives, if we think about older people as an asset and not a liability, I think we have a lot to gain in this new period. Thanks so much for having me today, Michelle. It's been awesome. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.